I started to say that this is a little bit different plan for us in that we have a genuine scriptural scholar with us tonight, and I'm very pleased about that because it seems to be someone who's an expert on the Old Testament. Seems to be a rather rare person in the church, and I just think this is such an important book. And I don't know how many of you caught the interview on Doug Wright's show. And by the way, Doug is here tonight. Wave. He interviewed David. That was broadcast this last Sunday. And so we always appreciate Doug's a big booster of benchmark books. And what is it up to now? Am I paying you $100 a month now, Doug? Or?
I think it's $3.
$40. But I just said a few words on that, and I'd like to reiterate the fact that I believe that this book is truly groundbreaking scholarship for the LDS market, because there's just so little that's been produced that I think, I won't say that there aren't good things that have been done, but this is one of the first attempts to bring in modern Bible scholarship, especially for the LDS audience. And the thing that I fear the most is that it won't get its proper due, that even if there's some miracle and many thousands of Latter-day Saints hear about the book in the first place, I just fear that they're not going to dive into this book as they should to get a perspective on the Old Testament that they won't get in any other way, probably because they're not going to read other scholars. We have such a distrust, don't we, of outside scholarship, and David has broken through that, whatever that ceiling is, in my opinion, and has produced a book that is truly accessible for us as an audience. I've read, when I say read, not studied like a scholar should, but quite a bit of commentary on the Bible, and I've sort of tried to keep in my mind who the sources are and when did they write and so on, the Bible, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and it's just sort of been more nebulous in my mind, trying to keep track of P and J and D and because it's just such foreign territory for Mormon readers. And David just pulls it all together and makes it so accessible, and I won't say it's easy, but it is approachable and accessible. It does take some effort, but it's not so technical that a person with average intelligence can't get into it and understand it and enjoy it. And so I applaud David for breaking this new ground for the LDS market and audience. I applaud Lloyd and Greg Koford for helping this book become a reality. And by the way, this is the first of 3.
First of a series also, too.
And the first of a series. And at some point, I hope you'll address how you're coming on the other volumes. But anyway, it's an important book. It's a book that I just wish and hope will reach a wide audience, because it deserves it. We need it. I know that the Gospel Doctrine Old Testament manual is plenty, but just in case you want to go beyond that, this is the book to read, and I just finished it today. I want you to know, but I've got to go back and really dig in deeper. But really enjoyed it, and I hope you will too. And I'll just say that David is a graduate of Brandeis University. I got a PhD from there, as well as another degree in Hebrew Bible and Ancient Near Eastern Studies, or is that close enough? Also attended BYU. He teaches at the University of Utah, and you're going to love the subject if you don't already know what it is. That's sex and the Bible. Maybe he'll talk a little bit about that. I mean, the Bible anyway, the Bible part of it. So he comes to us from a background that is second to very few, really. So I give you now David Bokovoy.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm grateful for that. Thank you all for coming as well. I'm really grateful to see so many people, friends, and to meet new people as well that are interested in the book. I'm grateful for that and for that very kind introduction. Let me just clarify a couple of points, though. I'm so grateful for the idea that the book could have a significant impact, hopefully, on a Latter-day Saint audience. While I appreciate that, that was never my goal, speaking personally. My goal was never that, to change the way that Latter-day Saints look at the Bible. Rather, this was a very personal project that I wanted to just show those who encounter critical studies that it is something that need not present problems for a Latter-day Saint, that it's something that we can address and that we need not fear. Granted, it may cause some challenges and problems for traditional faith assumptions and some of the paradigms that we may espouse as Latter-day Saints in terms of the development of Scripture. But still, paradigm shifting is something that takes place throughout our lives as we encounter new bits of knowledge and have to make sense of that in terms of our life view. And certainly, that paradigm shifting in the context of religiosity and spirituality is an important part of human development. I also wrote the book because I wanted to have something that would be available to an LDS graduate student that I would have liked to have had as I passed through my program, and which I didn't have access to. Let me clarify and state, though, that thank you for the introduction and stating it's nice to have a biblical scholar here to present. The room has a couple of very great biblical scholars here. My friend Dan McClellan here, who specializes in Hebrew Bible. Jared Anderson on the New Testament, a good friend of mine as well. In fact, if you're interested in the book as you make your way through and are introduced to historical criticism of the Old Testament, I will just recommend Jared's podcast that surveys the New Testament from that perspective, which by raise of hand, how many have listened to that before? Just a couple? Oh, shame on you. It is not to embarrass him, but that is, of all the LDS podcasting that I've listened to thus far, it remains my favorite. So obviously this is a topic you're interested in. If you want to see how someone can do the same sort of thing with the New Testament and what scholars come to in terms of the conclusion for the development of New Testament sources from a critical perspective, look at Jared's podcast and then pursue from there. Well, going back to why I wrote the book and my feelings about it, and the idea that I would have liked to have had something like this accessible when I was a graduate student myself. I'm going to be a little bit personal in this discussion, personal in a way that you just don't get in the book. And I'll start off by telling you a little bit about myself and my own religious journey. I grew up in San Diego County, basically on the beach, obsessed with surfing and rock and roll, and that's pretty much it, okay? Was not a good student in any way, shape, or form, and barely graduated from high school, and only graduated from high school because I was able to take art classes instead of language courses. Then went through some spiritual experiences and decided I would like to serve an LDS mission, was called to Brazil, and I had to learn Portuguese. So I go to the MTC having never studied anything in my life, really, certainly not a foreign language, and it was ridiculously hard. I was so overcome by the idea of studying Portuguese, and I was just so frustrated. I was one of those missionaries that really wanted to serve stateside so that I could teach the gospel in English, in a language I felt comfortable with. But developed a great passion for study, specifically scriptural study, church history study, while a missionary serving in Brazil. I quickly went through all of the legal books for an LDS missionary, and that was not enough. So I had access to like Doctrines of Salvation and Talmages, The Great Apostasy, teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, some in English, some in Portuguese, and I would wake up an hour early to make my way through those books. I figured if I bent the rules a little bit, if I was willing to wake up early to do so, that I could still retain my, status as a faithful and true missionary. But I kept thinking, I cannot wait until I get home from my mission and I'll have all the time in the world to study. I loved the proselyting thing, but what I really loved was studying, and I just couldn't wait to get home. And so I got home with what I felt like at that point was a pretty strong understanding of LDS doctrine and LDS history. And that passion continued as I took a job, volunteered at Pioneer Bookstore, not to present problems, but Pioneer Bookstore down in Utah Valley where I was, and I volunteered just for credit. So I got the Journal of Discourses and everything that I could get my hands on in terms of Mormon literature, and just poured over page after page of this material. And then I took an institute class, just because I thought it'd be a good religious experience. But I hate to admit this, but I will. I went in quite cocky, feeling like there was nothing that an institute teacher could teach me at that point. I hate to admit this, but I had this sort of confidence because I really devoted myself to such serious study. And besides that, my experience had been in like Sunday school classes where you really don't learn anything new. And so, but I figured it'll help me spiritually. And so I went, and this institute instructor at what was then Utah Valley Community College knew a little bit of Hebrew. And he wrote it up on the board, and I was intrigued with this magical language. And I thought, I must learn this, because it can enhance my understanding of the scriptures in a way that I just had never considered. So immediately began taking courses in Hebrew at Brigham Young University, which opened the door to studying various other ancient Near Eastern languages that help illuminate the world of the Bible. Developed a love for that, and then I applied for just one graduate program, Brandeis University, a non-sectarian Jewish institution in Boston. Now, if that makes no sense to you, in essence that means that Brandeis, as a Jewish institution, is not the BYU of Judaism. Okay? Very secular in its approach, although it is founded as a Jewish institution. And I was so excited because of their great reputation for Hebrew Bible and for ancient Near Eastern studies. It's the only program I applied to, the only one I wanted to go to, and I was thrilled at this opportunity. And then I was approached by my Hebrew professor at the time. And he said, you may want to reconsider this, David, going to Brandeis, because you will have to study with a recently, at that point, excommunicated member of the church. This man will never be unkind to you. He's a very kindly person. But it's clearly a reflection of how critical Brandeis is in their approach to Scripture. The only non-Jew they've ever had on their faculty in the Nedges department. And it's a reflection of an approach that, as a believing Mormon, you will not feel comfortable with. And I thanked him for that advice, and I was a little bit upset by it, but I still said, well, I want to know how scholars interpret the development of the Bible, but it's not going to affect my testimony. And then, just a short time after that, a couple weeks later, I was approached by another professor who came to me and said, David, I think this is wonderful that you're going to Brandeis. It's an excellent school. Jump into it with all your heart, mind, and soul, but don't do Bible. Do something on the side. Do comparative Semitics. Do Assyriology. Do anything, but don't do Bible, because we've yet to, in his words, yet to have a Latter-day Saint pass through a critical program such as that on the Bible and retain his or her religious convictions. Not that a lot have ever even tried it, but those who have done, I always end up outside of the church, so don't do it. And I said, I remember to this day, I said, well, thank you for the advice. I want to know how scholars interpret the development of the Bible, but I will never buy into something like the documentary hypothesis. Which, if you've read the book, will make you laugh. Right? Okay? I'll never buy into such an idea, but I'm going to go. I want to learn all about this. And he said, wonderful, go. And then I went, and I was in my first semester course as a master's student. This must have been 1998, and it was on ancient Near Eastern and biblical law. And I'd only been in for a few days when this professor had the slave laws in Leviticus and the slave laws in Deuteronomy lined up, and we were looking at these differences between debt slavery, something I address in one of the opening, I guess chapter 1 of the book. And I put it there intentionally because that was my own journey of how I came to terms with this idea of documentary sources in the Pentateuch. And I looked at that, and it just like a light bulb went off, and I thought, wow, these stem from different time periods, different people who have different perspectives on the concept of justice, and I'm going to have to make sense of this if I'm going to take the Bible seriously. And it was shocking, but it was also thrilling. It really was. It was exciting because all of a sudden, as I opened up my mind to the possibility of different historical sources, not only in the Pentateuch itself, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, but even in terms of the development of Isaiah, all of a sudden, these mysterious, strange books began to make considerable sense to me in a way that they just simply hadn't before, despite the years of study and interest that I had in these books. And so I don't want to present the idea that it was nothing but a difficult experience. It was just the opposite. It was thrilling and exciting and quite wonderful. But I could see where I was headed, and as much as I loved critical analysis of the Hebrew Bible, I wanted to retain my religiosity and my connection with Scripture. And so after I went to Brandeis with the intention of proving myself, doing very well, and then staying for the doctoral program, because what good does a master's degree do anyone in Bible? You have to go on and get the doctorate. And that was my plan. And so, I decided at that point, and I had 2 children, that in light of what I was learning and how much I enjoyed it, that it would be wise for me to try and go into church education. That way I could try and exist in both a devotional world and an academic world at the same time. And I made the decision specifically to go into seminaries and institutes for the church to retain my religiosity in light of what I was learning. Made that choice. And enjoyed a couple of years of teaching seminary, and then reapplied after a 4-year break to the program at Brandeis, and was hoping that I would get in. They really were only accepting 1 student a year for the PhD program at that time. And after a 4-year break of not working with the languages, I was a little bit nervous that I wouldn't get in, but when I was accepted and that door opened, I ran to that experience. So, now that I've shared this with you, and have opened myself up as the author in a way that you just won't know about in terms of the book, I'll tell you that I had this extraordinary experience last weekend. Went to Texas to visit with the Miller-Eccles study group and to give some presentations on my book. And it was wonderful. Met some wonderful individuals out there, including Adam Miller, who is a famous name now in Mormon studies, has done some wonderful books, including one for Koford. And it was great to meet Adam. I'd never met him before, and to be quite frank, I'd never read any of his books either. Okay, but I was excited, and pleased to meet him. And he recently wrote this wonderful little book called Letters to a Young Mormon, and he gave me a copy of it after our first presentation on Friday. He was gracious enough to do this, and I thanked him for it. And I went back to where I was staying that night and opened up the book and began to read. And it was a beautiful book. Couldn't put it down. Stayed up reading it, fell asleep, woke up Saturday morning, finished it off. Not that it's a long book, it's a short read, but still. I finished it Saturday morning and was so deeply touched by it that on Sunday night he came to another presentation that I gave, and the second I saw him I ran and just embraced him and gave him a big hug, which he received kindly enough, but I just had to hug him and say, thank you for writing this book. It meant a lot to me, and I believe it will mean a lot to other Latter-day Saints as well. And here I am pitching somebody else's book, but that's fine. I'm happy to do so. And let me just read to you just a line or two in light of what I've just shared about... No, I'm okay, thank you. In light of what I've just shared, I'll read to you a line. When Adam came in, I gave him a hug and then said, I have to read this line to you and tell you what it meant to me personally. So this is from his book, Letters to a Young Mormon, and Adam writes this line, giving advice. And he uses the term translation and analyzes it from a religious perspective, very similar to the approach that I took in my book, Authoring the Old Testament. To give you an insight into that, I argue, I make the case that when we consider Joseph's use of the word translation, we should conceptualize it in the way that he talks about translated beings. Individuals who are on a lower plane of existence, yet translated or moved to a higher spiritual realm. And that, in my mind, is the best way to conceptualize what he's doing in terms of the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. He's not working with the original Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek of the Bible. He is taking the English and translating it to a higher spiritual level. And this is something that how I explain the issue of it in my book and how I make sense of it. And Adam takes a very similar approach in his work, as in the chapter that he addresses on Scripture to a young Mormon. And he invites that person to make his or her own translations. Meaning, from his perspective, translate, take the book and make it relevant to you personally in your life. And then he states this. Sorry, let me find this. The more familiar you are with Israelite histories, Near Eastern archaeologies, and secular biblical scholarship, the richer your translations will be rendered. Don't be afraid for Scripture, and don't be afraid of these other books. Claim it all as your own. Doubtless the world's best books have their flaws, but that just means that they too must be translated. You'll need to translate them so that they can contribute to your own translations. And then Adam makes the point, as long as these other books help you to translate repentance, then you're still doing it right. Don't balk at this responsibility or hand it off to church leaders. Our minds go dark and our hearts go cold when we set this work aside. Anyway, it goes on. And I, of course, in light of my own journey, and I just shared to you, I was deeply touched by this, and I told him that. And after I gave him a hug, I said, so now you have to sign this book that you gave me, and he autographed it, and then I threw it in my bag and went home. And this was, so Monday morning, I got home from Texas, and Monday night sat down with my family to do our family scripture study, and I wanted to read this chapter to him, so I opened up the book and turned to where he had signed it, and I just thought he'd put his name there, but no, he'd written, "For David, translate!" Exclamation point. I'm very touched by that, just that simple signature, because of what it represented to me in my own life. So, that's the background to me personally as author and writer of this text. It is an introduction to historical criticism. My good friend Lloyd is the acquisition editor at Koford. He came to me about a little over a year ago, I guess, and said, "David, will you write an introduction on historical criticism in the Bible for an LDS audience?" And I said, "Sure, I'd be happy to do that." Back in my mind, I thought maybe 10, 15 years from now, okay? But not now. I was just very busy with a heavy teaching load and responsibility, and it was challenging because I thought, really, to do this at this point in my career might be a misstep, because if I was too apologetic in my approach, that could present challenges for me as a biblical scholar in an academic context. On the other hand, if I was too overly critical, it would present challenges to an LDS audience who faced these sorts of issues, and that's not what I'm about. I wouldn't want to do that as well. So I just didn't know. If I do this, and we continued to have talks, and he continued to push, and then finally, I don't know, it's just one day over, I think, Chinese food. We sat there, and I said, okay, let's do this. And once I'd made the decision to do it, it really just poured out of me, and it was a healing process in many ways, because for me it was like being able to just simply get out on paper and express ideas that I'd been working with and struggling with for quite some time. Historical criticism refers to analyzing the Bible in its historic context. Criticism means that we're taking a critical approach, not in the vein of critiquing the Bible, but being objective in our analysis of authorial intent. It refers to reading the Bible independent from any contemporary theological lens. And when scholars engage in this pursuit, the answers that they come to on who wrote the Bible are very different than the traditional religious paradigms that religious men and women hold today, whether Mormon or any other faith. And that can be a challenging endeavor for a believer of any sort. I argue, however, that Mormonism, from my perspective, is a philosophy that seeks to embrace all truth, let it come from whatever source it may, which is a direct quote from the prophet Joseph Smith. Therefore, if there is truth that scientists uncover in any field whatsoever, including textual analysis of the Bible, this is something that we ought to struggle with as Latter-day Saints, to try and wrap our minds around and to allow ourselves to be shaped by in our own perception of how not only we relate to that particular document of Scripture, but how we as individuals and as a community relate to divinity. Therefore, in my analysis of this material and introducing the way I reconstruct biblical source criticism of the first 5 books for an LDS audience, this touches upon other issues such as the Book of Moses, the Book of Abraham, and even the Book of Mormon. And in my analysis of that, I wanted to give an LDS audience, LDS graduate students, a paradigm. Now, people may accept or reject not only the way that I analyze source criticism, but even the way that I apply that to the development of LDS Scripture. And I'm more than okay with that. I may shift and have some different views on these matters in a year or two from now, and I hope that I have different views 10 years from now. I hope that I'm continually learning on this subject. The goal is not to convince someone that that I have all the answers on any of these topics whatsoever. The goal was simply to show that we need not be afraid to translate, to take words of wisdom out of the best books, and to help that inform our understanding of the development of the Bible and our relationship to divinity. So, I'm going to pause there and with that background, and I know that many came with questions, and I'm excited to take those and have an exchange. So.
Yes, David, I appreciate your comments there. Now how do you relate to the Latter-day Saint and, of course, Christians on the idea that Moses wrote the first 5 books, like in 1 Nephi chapter 5, for example, plus the introduction to the revision of Genesis. Because in the ensign for next month, April 2014, they're still putting out that those books were written by Moses, and most of that goes probably to the Liahona, so it goes worldwide.
Simple answer, I don't believe it. Okay. And in the book, the academic consensus for 130 years has been that rather than Mosaic authorship, that there are individual sources written by later Judean scribes that have been put together to create this volume of Scripture for us. And I'm very much a believer in that consensus. Now, I need to acknowledge the fact, and I do certainly, at least in the footnotes, that there is debate. I do this actually in the actual text as well. There is debate into, how many of those sources can really be attributed to actual documents that existed holistically at one point, versus how many of those sources were documents and fragments and supplementation. These are debates that scholars have and will continue to have as the years roll on. But still, the academic consensus is that we're dealing with individual sources written that reflect different historical time periods. And I certainly accept that view without question. Gary, yeah.
I have a two-part question, and I don't mean for it to monopolize the discussion or anything, so if you only want to answer one part, that's just fine with me. But my two-part question is also based on an assumption that some, or more than some, of what you do in the book is like walking a tightrope between contemporary mainstream LDS approaches to the Bible and then more scholarly approaches to the Bible, and you're trying to walk this tightrope between or along these different approaches. So the first part is, if you had submitted your manuscript to Fortress Press, what do you think some of the readers' comments would have been? And the second part is, and it kind of relates to Mike's question, I'm wondering if you would care to contrast and compare your approach to the Bible with the approach that is championed by the church education system today.
Good. So, in terms of the first question then, how would commentators or textual readers connected with Fortress Press, those who aren't aware, it's one of the academic publishers for Bible scholarship, what types of comments would I have received? I'm sure I would have received a little bit of pushback in terms of my specific view of the sources and how they relate to one another. I still think that it wouldn't have presented a problem, but as I've mentioned before, different scholars have a different way of conceptualizing not only the relationship of the sources in terms of textual parameters, but also how they developed historically. I have my own views that I hold right now, and I express those in the book. And they're based upon my understanding of Assyrian influences on scribalization. I have a chapter on that in the volume that lays out the reasons why Mesopotamian sources had a direct impact upon the first 5 books of the Bible. And so there are some what I would consider to be original contributions even to this in this volume. So it's not just a basic introduction to a Latter-day Saint audience. There are some original views on which I may be right or wrong. And I'm sure there'd be some pushback on some of those original contributions and elements. But as I articulate in the volume, a reader should not assume just because there are debates on some of the intricacies of the model that means that it is a weak way of looking at the Bible. Because it's not. It's, again, the academic consensus. Going back then to what you said about walking that tightrope, maybe you see that in the book. I didn't feel that as author in any way, shape, or form. The first few chapters are very similar to the types of ideas that I presented last semester in my survey of the Hebrew Bible course taught at the University of Utah. Not from a devotional perspective at all, but from the perspective of historical criticism or mainline biblical scholarship. First couple chapters, I don't feel like I'm walking a tightrope whatsoever. I feel like I try to connect it with Joseph Smith to open the door for an LDS man or woman who reads this book to feel like at least comfortable, to recognize that Joseph Smith can be defined as critical reader because he looks at the material and doesn't believe everything that is in there is necessarily a reflection of God's will or desire. So, yeah, I don't see that tightrope. And then the last couple chapters are just simply an explanation of how I'm able to exist intellectually right now in both worlds. Historical critic, believing Latter-day Saint, who accepts these books like the Book of Abraham, the Book of Moses, the Book of Mormon as inspired scripture, together with my understanding of Israelite sources and how they developed in the Bible. Now, for the second question, in terms of how does my approach, well, it's vastly different, right, than what we see in terms of church education, which tends to take things quite literally. I've tried to be very careful in not presenting myself as a representative of the church or church education whatsoever. I would never do that because I don't want to pretend that I have any sort of stamp of approval on their part for the way that I look at this material. I would hope that we would, as a people, as a community, not that I'm hoping that the church adopts my model by any stretch, I don't want that, but I would hope that we, in the process of becoming more comfortable with our own history as Latter-day Saints, something that has happened in recent years, that we would also become more comfortable with biblical scholarship and these views. And anyway, that's just a hope on my part. We'll see. Yes?
One of the things that I kept thinking about as I was reading the book was what were the motivations and why those different narratives were woven together, why those stories were so important to the different authors to have as part of this book. And I assume in your studies you've delved into that. What are their motivations and such? Are there places to go and look for that don't involve speaking Assyrian?
Definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. And you're right, that isn't something that in my basic introduction that I really felt like I wanted to delve into. Because when we move into that mode of thinking, from my perspective, we're dealing with interesting ideas that I find fascinating to explore, and maybe right or wrong to some extent, but ultimately are beyond what we can really see happening in terms of the text itself. Documentary analysis is textually driven, and some critics, even in LDS academia of documentary analysis, have made the claim that, biblical scholarship that takes source criticism seriously is weak, because in other ancient Near Eastern documents we actually have textual development that we can document and analyze from that perspective, whereas we're making up the sources when we do the same thing in the Bible. That's a misconception. We're not making up the sources. The sources are there. They contradict one another. It's hard to make the text, have it make sense as if we take the text seriously. I mentioned the slave laws, right? But there are also challenges interpreting stories like, as I point out, the Noah story, the Joseph story, whereas once we start to delve into it and pull the narratives apart, we're able to see consistency line up in the way that I explained it in the book. So that's a misconception. We are dealing with real sources. They're right there in the Bible, and so that's an issue to address and consider that is sometimes misunderstood. So that was my focus, was really to stay textually driven and based. There have been various theories as to why different Israelite communities would have connected with certain patriarchal ancestors of the past, and why they would have preserved that particular story of Joseph, for example, and how that related to Yahweh as their local tribal deity. Hopefully this piques readers' interest, and they're able then to delve into some of the recommendations I have for secondary analysis and to continue that study, because there are sources like that available to consider. In terms of my recommendations, I kept it very basic, but those sources as well as my footnotes, can lead readers that are interested in that particular topic to pursue some of the studies that are done. But also, in addition to the Mesopotamian influence that we see directly impacting the development of the first 5 books, there are no question sacred oral traditions that these communities had about their patriarchal ancestors that to some extent have influenced the development of these biblical documents. So, basic answer.
So, what do you think about the Joseph Smith translation over the last, since it was introduced into the King James Version? I'm wondering, where does it stand right now? It's in the footnotes, but don't, as Latter-day Saints, typically we're looking to the King James Version, but then we've got these footnotes from Joseph Smith. But what's going to happen in the future on the Joseph Smith translation? Is it going to become, is it moving into a higher tier or something in relationship to the King James Version?
Well, I don't have that prophetic gift, right?
I want you to come up with that.
But to make predictions of that sort, I'll just tell you my personal approach as a Latter-day Saint, that I don't see Joseph Smith restoring original theological constructs or literary forms for the biblical sources. I don't see that happening. I see it more as a translation effort in the way that I defined it a couple of minutes ago, as taking a document and bringing it into a higher spiritual plane for an LDS audience. And I think there's great value to that. In some ways we could make the argument, and I would as a believing Latter-day Saint, that endeavor is much more important than restoring some original text written by an ancient patriarchal figure of the past, including Abraham and his book that we have in our scripture. So, yeah.
I haven't read your book yet, but I certainly will. In the book One Eternal Round, which was a compilation of Hugh Nibley's research, they're rather free in going from one historian to another, experts, and picking pieces out of each one of them. I'm a little suspicious of doing that. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I'm in reading in there is that Nibley is not at all reticent about going in an original document and just plowing through, ignoring everything else, and giving his own free interpretation.
I would agree with that assessment.
So, is your approach somewhat like that?
I hope not.
Thank you.
Is that on am I on record for? I guess I hope not. I agree with you. I think that's problematic, and no offense to Brother Nibley, who's a wonderful man and whom I relate to spiritually on so many levels. Yeah. Especially, I'll just speak frankly. It's about me, I guess, in a way. I connect with Approaching Zion. I think it's one should be added to the standard works, okay, of the church. But other than that,
Next conference.
Yeah. Other than that, I would agree with your assessment.
So you have the Bible tradition. You have pseudo-epigraphic authors, mm-hmm. so forth and so on. And you have people who've tweaked the text for their own purposes later on. Now take Joseph Smith, mm-hmm. and he's tweaked the text of the Bible. He's introduced pseudo-epigraphical texts, I presume you'd say Abraham and Moses. Where would you put him in the context of biblical authors? What kind of terminology fits with Joseph Smith? Saying 500 years, the Bible includes the Book of Mormon and the Book of Moses. What would the scholars of the future be classifying those as?
Good. A wonderful book to read is actually back there on the shelf of Jared. I saw him hold it up a second ago. It's Forged, by Bart Ehrman. I'm a big fan of his, and Jared studied with him, and I love his work. And that's a particularly helpful book in terms of understanding the concept of why ancient Christians would produce documents that they attributed to apostolic leaders and figures of the past. Sure.
So really quick, forgery is kind of a scary word. Would you think rewritten Bible is going to be an analog?
I thank you, and I make the point in my book, although I cite a couple of passages from Ehrman, I make the statement that forgery really is a problematic term for what Joseph Smith is doing. And I would argue as well that, and I do in the book, that we cannot even use the term fiction Some people say when you want to say that the book of Moses or book of Abraham is pseudepigraphic, that it is fiction, even inspired fiction. And the problem with that is that I believe that genre labeling is really, really important when we seek to interpret a text. And if we give the text the title fiction or forgery, that will give us a lens to interpret, which will lead to a misinterpretation, from my perspective, of what the prophet Joseph Smith is doing in those volumes of Scripture. I lay out in great detail in my book that as a believing Latter-day Saint, I look at it as an inspired, the book of Moses, for example, is an inspired pseudepigraphic source. Falsely attributed to Moses, but in the sense that Moses is used by the prophet Joseph Smith in the same way that some of the other writers in the Bible used ancient figures of the past as an instrument or tool to invoke the revelatory process. And Moses is the great mediator between God and the covenant people. Not only that, but he's the traditionally assumed author of those first 5 books. So to take this important figure ties into Joseph Smith's idea of dispensationalism and allows Latter-day Saint readers to have a more spiritual approach to the Bible with its different voices. I use the analogy in my particular book of a rejection of creation ex nihilo on the part of Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith rejects the idea of creation out of nothing, the traditional Judeo-Christian belief. Should probably separate those, okay, to be not so offensive, but anyway, Jewish-Christian belief. But the point is that in the Jewish-Christian belief, traditionally, God creates the world out of nothing. Joseph says, no, there's no such thing. God organizes the world, the universe, the cosmos out of matter. And he goes through this divine creative process. Creation does not exist in a vacuum. Well, I use that as a model then to understand the book of Moses, the book of Abraham. And from my perspective, Joseph Smith is imitating the divine creative process itself. He's taking the chaos that exists in the Bible with various authorial voices that contradict one another and giving it structure through Moses as instrument. Transforming the way we as Latter-day Saints read the opening chapters of the Bible into temple source material. For those opening chapters then are presented from the perspective of a revelation that Moses receives on an exceedingly high mountain, and allow us as Latter-day Saint readers to jump into the text and put ourselves into it as if we're a part of that in terms of our own experience with divinity. I think that's extraordinary. I love that idea. To me, it speaks to my soul, and I take a very similar approach to the book of Abraham. And so I don't fear the concept of labeling those sources as pseudepigraphic. I do directly in the book itself.
So how was David Wright as a teacher?
Wonderful. Wonderful. I was both friend and mentor to me in my life. And I specifically chose him for my doctoral chair of my dissertation.
So he wasn't scary?
Just the opposite. Those of you who have met him, he is a very kind, loving individual whom I think very highly of, without question. Yeah.
A question for you on, for those that are involved in trying to promote Bible reading amongst Latter-day Saints, what translations or editions of the Bible ought we to be using that are good for Latter-day Saint study?
Good. That's a great question. I sent a couple of initial chapters to my very good friend, Grant Hardy, who was very kind, but he immediately wrote back and said, why are you quoting from the King James Version of the Bible, trying to teach source criticism to an LDS audience? And I said, it's a good question. The reason why, and I explained that right in the very introduction, is because I wanted to show an LDS audience that these insights can be directly applied to the Bible that we typically use, and can enhance our study and appreciation of that text. But I also encourage my readers to certainly take advantage of more recent translations. And I would encourage readers to get a good study Bible. I'm a big fan, and that's probably the best way to start, is to get a good study Bible, a good Oxford University Press's study Bible. The NRSV is outstanding. I'm using that one for my current course at the University of Utah on sex in the Bible. I told Kurt not to blush when he said that title. And I used last semester for my survey of the Hebrew Bible course that I taught at the U, the Jewish Publication Society Study Bible, which was edited by one of my professors, Mark Bretler. I think it's a wonderful volume. It is put together and can give people a good introduction to historical criticism, and I would go in that direction. The Jewish Publication Society translation was done in 1985, and any translation is an interpretation, and that means it's problematic, which is why you need to come to the University of Utah and study Hebrew.
Did you, I might have missed it, but did you talk about your other 2 volumes at all?
Not yet, thank you. This book, although it flowed out of me, so to speak, and was definitely a healing process, as I mentioned, it was tough because of my heavy teaching schedule and the fact that I have an incredibly patient wife who walked in a while ago and who supported me in every project that I've undertaken, and I'm grateful for that. And she's just been so wonderful, helping me to raise 4 children while pursuing my ambitions and desires, and very grateful for her. And basically I have the second volume more or less written at this point. Third volume, not so much. So I am quite optimistic that we can get the second volume out before the end of the year, which is an introduction to Israelite prophecy, the Deuteronomistic history. It will be a fun book to have out because it's going to deal honestly and openly with the issue of authorship in terms of Deutero-Isaiah, which source criticism of the Pentateuch, as I explain in my volume, I don't think it's all that difficult for the Book of Mormon's claims for ancient authenticity. There are some challenges, and I admit those, and I'm open with them. Deutero-Isaiah, that's a tough one. Okay, that's a hard one. So, be excited.
Lately I've run into something I thought was rather exciting. It had to do with the general destruction done all over the Middle East at the end of the Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age. And the author tends to bring in the Israelite tribes as part of that, which, you know, it looks interesting. But what you're saying, it really caught my attention in that you're talking about Assyrian sources, you're talking about others. Is there a trend now to looking at these other different sources outside of Israel, and in your criticism of the Bible?
Looking at them from what vantage point? Or to what end?
I'm not sure. I just see modern history going in the direction, modern historians going in the direction of showing that Egypt, Babylonia, Assyria, and so forth were not compartmentalized. There was a lot of flow of culture and education back and forth. And I'm wondering, is that the direction you're going?
Yes, to an extent. My argument in the book is the one that I hold to, and that is that Mesopotamia had a much greater impact upon Judean scribalism than Judean culture had upon Mesopotamia. It's because Judean culture, although the Bible is so foundational to our development of our own society, that we tend to look at that Judean community and the scribalism there and think that, you know, that was the high point of human culture. It certainly wasn't. Far from it, right? And it makes no sense historically. Then, for instance, some have questioned, for example, Enuma Elish has clear connections with which is a Babylonian story of how Marduk, the chief god of ancient Babylon, becomes the chief god of the universe, and it has a beautiful creation story in it, and it's directly connected in some way with the Bible, and it kind of shows some connections there, and some conservative readers will start to ask the question, well, isn't it possible that the biblical account influenced like Enuma Elish rather than the other way around? And it's absolutely impossible. Well, not only in terms of, because of the relationship between this very small community and the more dominant Mesopotamian culture, which was training these Judean scribes in their ability to create sources, but also because of the just sheer date of the documents itself. So there is definitely sharing between cultures without question, but still the dominant influence upon the Bible is Mesopotamia, to the point that, as was once famously articulated, without Babel there would be no Bible. And that's true.
Can you make any generalizations about your opinion of the Joseph Smith translation, starting from, if you concur, that his translation of Genesis 1:1 is nonsensical?
No. So you're not talking Joseph Smith translation, you're talking about his analysis of Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 in his later discourses and sermons.
Well,
where he gave a translation. Just trying to make sure we're on the same.
Well, if you agree that his translation of Genesis 1:1 makes no sense, can you generalize from your study of the Joseph Smith translation and the book of Genesis in particular, can you give us your opinion as to how acceptable you find his translation of the Bible?
Again, we're not talking Joseph Smith translation. We're talking about his interpretation later in the King Follett sermon of Genesis 1:1, for instance, where he says, the head God called forth the gods.
But not just that. I'm talking about, I mean, if he translates Genesis 1:1 in a way that makes no sense, and I've studied Hebrew as well, it makes no sense to me. I'm wondering then, when we read the rest of the Old Testament and Joseph Smith's changes to that in his translation, should we just accept that, despite what he did with Genesis 1:1, that the rest of his translation makes a lot more sense and is acceptable? Or do you find that there's a lot of in there that really doesn't make a lot of sense?
Joseph was very free and creative in his analysis of Hebrew. And he used Hebrew in the same way, I would argue, that he used Egyptian hieroglyphic characters as a springboard for revelatory insights. A believer may accept or reject those insights as inspired, and that's a matter of faith. We can certainly say that I would agree with you that the way that he breaks apart the Hebrew is problematic in terms of producing a literal translation of those various words, the taking out of the bait and talking about Rosh as the head, and it's very creative, without question. But I guess it's just, as a believer myself, I love those insights. I think they're fascinating to see Joseph try to understand his relationship to divinity and express that through his efforts to study out languages, sources, material, and bring them into harmony with his own experiences with God. And for me, there's great power in that as a religious person who believes he was a prophet. So I would separate that, however, from the Joseph Smith translation, which, as I've shared, is not a rendering of Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek. It's working with the English of the Bible and giving a new interpretation, version, or translating in the sense of bringing it to a different plane where we might read it as Latter-day Saints. And that would be an independent assessment for a believer, from my perspective, than whether or not he could actually work with a language and give a correct interpretation of that script. That's how it is. Okay. There's a question in the back.
Let's make this the last one.
Okay.
I had one. Just to make sure I'm not confused, I do plan on buying your book and reading it.
Good, because I make about $1 per volume.
This is his retirement.
It'll contribute substantially to my student loan debt.
So are you taking all of your your information from the Bible and from these Bible classes that you've taken? Or are you taking some of it from the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible? I know you were saying that you footnoted a few things in there from the Joseph Smith translation.
Mm-hmm.
Are you using both sources, or are you only using it directly from the Bible classes?
The first few chapters really deal with historical analysis, source criticism, and the development of Pentateuchal sources as I currently see it. And again, they reflect the way that I teach the material to my students at the University of Utah in survey courses. So I really don't deal, I bring it and connect it with LDS Spot, with some general authorities quotes and things of that matter that talk about the importance of reading the scriptures intelligently. John A. Whitsoe gives us is a good example of this. I'm a huge fan of B.H. Roberts, as I know many here are. I just love him. He's one of my favorite figures of the past. I'll quote from Elder Roberts and other LDS sources, but other than that, it's very much just very similar to what you would receive in an academic context of taking a survey on the development of the Pentateuch. At least basic portions of it. The second half of it then takes and applies that understanding to the books of Scripture that we have as Latter-day Saints, the Book of Moses, Book of Abraham, Book of Mormon, and shows how a believing Latter-day Saint who accepts those models, and again, I'm not asking a Latter-day Saint to accept those models at all, but those who do, like myself, how we can look at it and open the door to applying that to our Scriptures, to believing in those sources still as inspired text, shifting our paradigms perhaps a bit to make sense of the material, and not be afraid to engage the material head on and take whatever truths we obtain in this process and make it part of who we are as Latter-day Saints and how we connect with divinity. And so the second half of the book then deals with that topic specifically. And in that pursuit, I certainly don't have all the answers. I have a way right now that makes sense to me, but I hope this book will open up the door for serious dialogue in the LDS community, that we can debate back and forth about textual divisions, about to what extent documentary analysis versus supplementary analysis and the different types of theories that scholars work with are attested there in the text, and then how we take that and make sense of our own Scripture as Latter-day Saints. Because that's a dialogue and exchange that I think that we really need to have in our community, and I hope the door opens up for that possibility. Thank you all so much for coming.